The Government Business Executive Forum is proud of its long-standing partnership with GOVINI, whose analysis, research, and presentations add substantial value to the annual GBEF agenda. Importantly, GOVINI sets the stage each year for CES Government with its theme-relevant analysis and presentation. As with SpaceX and Palantir, GOVINI has emerged as one of the leading West Coast companies, providing essential services in support of the national security of the United States. Last month, the Department of Defense chose GOVINI for a single award, $400 million contract to be the enterprise-wide partner for SaaS analytics and data science in support of implementing the National Defense Strategy. Today, GOVINI's president, Dougherty, and its senior vice president of strategy, Jim Mitre, are here to share custom analytics and data exclusive to CES Government attendees. Tara and Jim will walk through America's current technological positioning against China and address specific areas of vulnerability and opportunity in critical areas like artificial intelligence, 5G, and IoT. Please join me in welcoming Tara and Jim.
Good morning, and thanks so much to Don Upson and the CESG family for having us here. We appreciate the partnership throughout the years. As the intro relayed, we're going to talk a little bit about global trends in research and development and the implications they have for the United States government, in particular the Department of Defense. And then we're going to take stock on the Department of Defense's investment in research, development, test, and evaluation, see how they're doing. Now, the last time the United States was in a geopolitical competition was, of course, with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And during that period, it was the government that was providing the key technologies that helped shape that competition. Things like microelectronics, the internet, and global positioning systems had a profound impact on the nation's ability to win that geopolitical competition. Today, it's a very different climate. We're in a competition with China, and that competition is primarily occurring in the political, economic, and military spheres, but it's being accelerated by what's happening in the technological domain. And this is just a very different challenge because China is much more of a robust economic player. And as a result, they're putting much more investment in their technological development. One of the challenges that we have as a nation is the way that we're structured is obviously very different than that of the Chinese. The Department of Defense, with the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, trying to work together, they struggle many times to operate coherently just as a department, let alone trying to think about how the government operates coherently. And then from there, thinking about across the nation, how we can leverage the best of breed from around America to help with this competition. China's model is much more different, right? They're focused on a centrally managed approach to technological development. And something that Xi Jinping has announced is Made in China 2025 is a national level effort to ensure that China, or at least to try to ensure that China will develop the key breakthrough technologies in things like information technology, which is obviously critically important to the changing character of warfare that is happening within the military sphere. Things like aircraft and vessel development, as well as the manufacturing systems that underpin them. And of course, the industrial base more broadly. And here China has a coherent effort, what they call civmil fusion, to try to leverage the best from the civilian space and to ensure that those technological developments are actually helping to inform the modernization of the Chinese army. And then on top of that, China is engaged in an illicit and licit means of extracting technology from America on the order of billions of dollars in intellectual property theft that is working very well in helping them catch up to the United States. We're almost at the 2-year anniversary later this month on the department's release of the National Defense Strategy. And this strategy says a couple of really important things as it relates to this geopolitical competition. First, it identifies this period of time as China and Russia being the priority as opposed to terrorism. So it's a strategic reorientation for the department. The second thing it says is that the Department of Defense's primary role within this competition is to deter war from happening, to ensure that China would not look to settle a political dispute through use of military force. And then the third thing it says is that the department is currently not in a great position to be able to do that, to deter China from war. And what it really needs to focus on is modernizing its force through better use of technology so that it'll be more lethal in a future combat environment against the Chinese. Now, we just put out a new white paper that hopefully you all have copies of. They should be distributed here. We would most welcome any feedback on it. And what we're going to do now is kind of walk through some of the key insights from that paper. It starts with a look at some of the global trends, as I mentioned. And this chart here starts to show the stark contrast between the way the government was engaging in research development in the Cold War relative to how it's happening now. As you can see on the circle on the left, the inner part of the circle looks at the United States investment relative to the world, and then the outer ring breaks it apart within the United States or within the rest of the world. And you can see that the Department of Defense in 1967 was around 19% of the overall investment in the world, and the US government added another 20% to it. Given those numbers, it's actually not at all surprising that a lot of the key technologies were coming from government, right? Things like the internet, et cetera, and that's what's shaped the modern economy. But if you look over at the circle on the right, you'll see it's a very different story today, where the Department of Defense is around 4% of global R&D, and with the rest of government, that totals only 7%. What that means is that the department, by necessity, needs to partner with those outside of government to try to get the best technology. And the game here has shifted from whichever military can build the best technology to whichever can find the key technology somewhere in the world and find a military application for it. Focusing on the US-China dynamic, you can see here on the chart on the left just how quickly China's rise has played out in the research and development space. It's an extraordinary growth just within the past 20 years, exponential growth as they're catching up to the United States. Interestingly, the chart in the middle shows that in the business sector, China has already passed America in terms of overall research and development investment. And then over in the government sphere on the far end, you'll see that the United States government investment in R&D has actually been trending downwards over the last few years. In China, while it's not exponential growth there, it's linear growth, is on a path to potentially pass the government spending here in the near future as well.
So these are a lot of serious takeaways. And the title of our presentation and our paper is actually America's Eroding Technological Advantage. But yesterday, as I sat through the executive roundtables, I heard over and over US government leaders talking about everything they're doing to reverse these trends. And it was exciting. And I heard over and over people talk about the importance of data and about working together and transparency and visibility. And one way in which GOVINI helps in those challenges is through these taxonomies that you're seeing now. This taxonomy in particular shows a presentation of Department of Defense-wide spending in the area of research and development over a time period of FY 2015 to 2019. And what it's showing you is the orange boxes represent major categories of that research and development. This is something that you might think should be easily understood and easy to view and track, but it's not. And the scale of the numbers, if you look at those values inside those orange boxes, you see a number representing the total amount of spending in that entire category, as well as a 5-year growth trend, either going up or going down. The white boxes underneath get even more granular. And what comprises those subcategories represented in the white boxes are down to every detail, the dollars that are being put against that particular effort. Fundamentally, this gives you a broad view of what is happening in this research and development space and the ability to compare it to the priorities and strategies that Jim talked about. You see green arrows assigned with things like lethality, air and missile defense, space and cyber, C4ISR, and autonomy. These are all things that we know as a nation and as a department that we need to invest in order to win this competition with China. But there's still more to be done, for sure. So once you have this kind of visibility, it unearths trends that we need to grapple with, some good and some that need reversing. So one insight, for example, is that the department has spent nearly 4 times more research and development money over that time period on manned systems than it did on unmanned systems. You can see the scale of the difference here. Again, it's getting your hands around the data so that you can put it in check against your priorities and say, is this the right move for the future of military operations and the future of our country? This graph shows you, on balance, major categories of activity as represented in the taxonomy according to the total investment along the x-axis, how much money are we spending in these areas represented by the bubbles, and on the y-axis, it's representing that 5-year growth period. So you can see that things above the dividing line in the middle mean they've been continually on the rise, and those that fall below have been losing investment over that time period. And then the size of the bubble and their placement on the x-axis is giving you a sense of overall how much money are we putting behind these areas. There are a couple of examples that show, again, in a consistent way, whether we are matching up our strategy and our intentions with what we're actually doing from an execution perspective. One great example, because you can see just how different they are in terms of placement on this graph, are 2 different types of missile defense. We are putting an exceptionally large amount of money into ballistic missile defense, and we have been for quite some time. This is a suite of capabilities that is meant to defend the United States against a few, but potentially very damaging ballistic missile attacks from a country like North Korea. Compare that to the spending that we're putting against air and cruise missile defense, which is really about protecting the United States and its allies, our theater forces and bases around the world from tactical ballistic and cruise missiles, a capability that the Chinese are much more likely to use against us. Investment in both of these areas is absolutely critical, and it's the right thing to do for US national security. But we need to look at the disparity and think about whether it matches up with what we intend to do and what we need to do to be safe. Okay, so we know what we want to invest in. We know that innovation is critical to this fight and our future. Where is the innovation in the United States happening? Well, we have a pretty good sense of where it's taking place, and you can see these designated on the map. These are the tech hubs that you are familiar with and that we see exciting new innovations coming out of all the time. Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Denver, New York, Boston. We know that there's a tremendous amount of exciting work being done in the United States technology industry, and the question is the government capturing that? So we looked at, well, where is DoD working? Where is DoD putting all of this funding that we're talking about from a research and development perspective? If you take just artificial intelligence, for example, there's lots of data on what DoD is doing in the field of AI and with whom it's partnering in the vendor world. When you put that against the chart we just looked at and you line it up with these blue bubbles that represent the United States tech hubs, it doesn't line up so nicely. The trend that we see is that DoD is going back to the same places that it's used to working with, even in new areas like AI. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's a tremendous amount of value that these companies have to offer to the Department of Defense, and they know how to work with our military and civilian defense officials. But it does tell us that we likely aren't harnessing the great organizations that are doing really critical, innovative work who don't yet know how to work with DoD. And so as we continue to make great strides and take significant initiatives to work more with the innovation community in the United States, we need to also be checking, is it turning out the results that we hope for? I would say based on this chart, so far the answer is no.
So where does that put us in terms of where we go from here? This chart looks at the Department of Defense's investment over time, as well as the Department's investments in research, development, and test and evaluation. The blue line being the overall investment, and the orange being the RDT&E budget. And what you can see is that the RDT&E budget is actually at historical highs as a share of the department's overall investment. Not just that, as we project forward, even if the Department of Defense's budget were to continue to increase a bit, the pressure on the RDT&E account is such that it's probably not going to grow very much. And that's because there's greater cost growth happening in other accounts, like operations and maintenance, sustainment of future equipment is going to be more, military personnel costs are growing, and procurement costs are growing. So it's going to be increasingly difficult for the department to try to get more out of its RDT&E budget by investing more in it. As that relates to the China-US competition, we could look at it through a chess analogy, we could look at it through a Go analogy, as many like to do with China. The point is that we're in a move, counter-move, counter-counter-move dynamic here when it comes into this military competition. And how technology is going to affect that is critically important. If we can't outspend the Chinese like we were able to in many ways with the Soviet Union, we're going to have to be much more selective in terms of where those dollars go. And if we can't grow our RDT&E budget much more, we're going to have to really focus on trying to ensure that those investments are the right investments, replacing the right bets on the key technologies. In order to do that, data analytics can help serve as a guide. Thank you very much. Thank you.